Tanya Fetui Tolman. I always knew her as Tanya Fetui, and then she married Ty and Tolman now. Was a facilitator here in the Kennedy Center and worked with the South Africa field study program. And she went twice, once as a student, came back and we employed her here, and then she went back as a team lead. Worked with a variety of things. I'm sure you'll tell us about some of those, everything from like street children, other development issues, literacy, women in literacy and things like that. Tanya went on and got an MOB, I believe, was it an MOB, Masters of Organizational Behavior here? But Tanya, she taught the prep course for a few years, and I just have to say, she's an amazing teacher, and I'm glad to see that she's doing consulting and stuff, because her abilities to communicate are really well, and I think you'll enjoy listening to her insights here today. And we just welcome you, Tanya. I think you're just, whenever I have thoughts of Tanya, she's just these really pleasant, wonderful, warm memories. And so we'll turn the time over to you now. Thank you.
Okay, it's so great to be here. I was just telling Dave that I thought I'd be so nervous coming back to the Kennedy Center. It's been a long time. But I just really feel a sense of, this is home. This is where, these are my formative years as I grew on this educational campus. And I feel very, at home here. So I'm really excited to be here. It was really hard to try to figure out what to talk about, because I've had so many experiences with this program, with the Kennedy Center and International Studies, and also in South Africa, and to be able to sort of package that tightly into a neat little presentation is very difficult when you have so many experiences and emotions that come along with it. So I'll try my best to articulate to you the learnings that I have taken from being a member of the South African Field Studies program. And so when I was forming my presentation, one of the thoughts that came to mind is boundaries, and what are they? And I pulled up a definition of boundaries in the American Atlas, and these are some of the characteristics of boundaries. It talks about that they define regions as characteristics different from each other, that they divide one area from another, and that they're divided by humans. And I thought the interesting part of that definition was that they make divisions between different areas, and they basically define differences. And as I was thinking about this concept of boundaries, I thought about how my learning in South Africa has, although it comes from one specific boundary, it has transcended to all different areas of my life. And if you think about it, we have boundaries everywhere. We have them that divide us in countries. This is my land, this is your land. We have boundaries in the university. I started my education here in sociology and in international studies, and then I made the tremendous leap to the business school, which felt like a completely different world. But there are boundaries in our educational system. Everywhere we have boundaries, and we even make boundaries within ourselves that divide us as people and as cultures and as individuals. And when I think about South Africa Field Studies and what I learned, I realized that those boundaries were diminished in some ways, that the things that I learned I was able to take into different avenues in my life. It's been 7 years, which I feel really old, since I last stepped foot in South Africa. But the things that I learned there, I've used in every different stage of my life, from undergraduate to graduate school to becoming a wife and a mother, and to starting a career in business. So it's one of those things that I'd like to articulate to you, and hopefully that message can come across of how those learnings have transcended the boundaries of my life. Let me see. I'm getting used to this. So this is one of my favorite pictures, and all the pictures in this presentation I took by myself, and this is before the day and age of digital cameras, so they aren't the greatest quality. But let me share with you a small excerpt from my journal. Because in order to, be able to communicate to you the learnings that I learned in South Africa, I have to sort of take you through an abbreviated tour of what I did there as a student and as a researcher. And this picture I took, and I'm describing the moment in my journal. So I say, I moved my camera into focus and zoomed in on this beautiful woman. Her head was wrapped in a bright blue duke, and the colorful rags of her dress blew loosely in the sea wind. I zoomed in closer in her face, and I was focused. Was taken back by her beauty. Her cheekbones were firm and distinguishing of an African woman. As I looked into her, I wondered how this woman spent her days. Her skin drew signs of many years past. I wondered how this woman had spent her life, the story behind every wrinkle that formed in and around her eyes, and her solemn smile. I wondered what pictured memories hid behind those bright and colorful eyes. Suddenly her face brightened with a smile. She was looking right at me. Molo Sisi, she called out to me, "You want to take a photo?" So very used to tourists, I guess. She asked, and I was more than privileged to. At that point, she motioned to her kids, and they all gathered around, and they posed for the picture. And let me see. So with her children clinging to her sides at the backdrop of the wild Indian Ocean behind her, she stood with the stance of a war hero. Her shoulders were back, and her shoulders and her back were straight, with her eyes closed and her head tilted towards heaven. She patiently posed for a few seconds, and then with a click of my camera, I thanked her, and she nodded with a smile, bent down to her plastic container, as you can see in the corner, and she said, "I must fetch water," and she turned to leave, and her children followed her. I and many others that day had come to the beach to get away and to get caught up on some work and to have some leisure time. This woman had come to the beach to fetch water from a tap. From like a water tap on the corner of the beach. Water to wash clothes with, water to wash dishes with, to cook with, and to bathe with, and to care for her children, something that I merely turned to tap for in the comforts of my own home. The image of this mother's noble pose with the raging sea behind her is what being a black woman and mother in South Africa is all about. It's about one crashing, rolling wave after another. It's about standing amongst the raging sea and feeling the violent blows that roll in methodically. It is about facing a large mass of power, yet somehow surviving. And it's about getting back up and moving on with your daily life. So when I read that journal entry, it brings back so many emotions, and I don't know whether to cry or to laugh at myself because I was such an intense person at that time, and just trying to soak in everything that I was learning and trying to make sense of the world and about the situation of women and what they were going through in South Africa. My mom describes me as a born feminist, but I think I have a little inkling she had a lot to do with that. I don't think it was necessarily inborn, but I've always had a propensity to wanting to understand womanhood and how the world interacts in relationships with women and their place in society. It's always been something that from a very young age I've been interested in wanting to learn more about. So South Africa was the perfect platform for that learning for me. So as I've told you before, I started studying gender stratification, and there's a lot of different ways to look at what gender stratification is and the status of women in society, and South Africa is a very interesting case study in this school or discipline of thought. But basically stratification or gender stratification is defined as one's ability to have access to power, prestige, and autonomy, and I also added an economic status. This is a well-used or often used framework for studying gender stratification and looking at these indices of, where women lie in society and in status. And I don't have time to go into this a lot because I want to focus more on the experiential side than on the research side. But power and prestige come from at all different levels, from the government side, from the community level, from a household level, and from an individual level. And so I examined each of those aspects of power and prestige. In terms of prestige, a lot of times in order to study gender stratification, you look at work. And as you know, universally women spend most of their time, or the majority of women in the world spend most of their time in what is called reproductive labor, which oftentimes, basically it's the daily tasks that you have to do over and over again, washing the dishes, or in South African context, getting water from the well, getting firewood, going to the store, standing in line, caring for children, changing diapers, all those things that are of value, but they're in that informal sector. They aren't, by society, don't attach a lot of prestige to that. Whereas women in South Africa have been said, like at a certain time, I think it was 1994, I've said that they had spent an average of 6 hours a day walking to a well, to get water back and forth. So little tasks like that take up so much time that are important to the livelihood and the vitality of human life still go undervalued and are not attached with a lot of prestige. So I looked at that also. I looked at the economic status, and I'll go into some statistics later, but the feminization of poverty is a concept that has been studied a lot, especially in South Africa. But how does poverty specifically target the most underrepresented or vulnerable population, and that is women and often children. And then autonomy in South African culture and also the studies of women and gender, the idea that women are perpetual minors, meaning that there's always someone that holds authority over them. So and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but even in marital traditions in the patriarchal society and traditional South African culture, a woman never owns land. Excuse me. So when she's married into a family, the husband will own the land. If the husband passes away, then it goes to the oldest son or to another family member, but it always goes through the male line, which has tremendous implications on autonomy and on how you make decisions and the power of making decisions in the household. So another way, so these are a lot of ways to look at gender stratification and analyze it, but one of the ways that I looked at it, and coming from the International Studies program here, is we talk a lot about culture, and that's one of the ways to prepare yourself for going abroad. And so I really wanted to look at the status of women in South Africa, gender stratification specifically, and how culture influenced it. And I know probably a lot of you guys have taken the prep course or been involved in it, but culture encompasses these things. The definition of culture, that it's learned. We aren't born with knowing that you're supposed to put your fork on the right side of the table or whatever it is. I don't know. I guess I never learned in my culture. It also provides a sense of shared meaning. People of the same group or the same culture, they have a sense of, this is that certain objects and words and language have meaning behind them, and everyone shares that meaning to some degree or the other. And then it's a formation of reality. I like the visualization of the idea that you have that your culture is like a pair of glasses, and it's how you see the world, and it's the formation of your reality. And this is a really an aspect that I learned a lot about in South Africa, working, discussing, and serving the women in South Africa. And then the last piece is that it's dynamic, that it changes, and it's influenced by environmental factors and political factors that are happening all around us. So I really wanted to look at culture and how it could what it could teach me about the status quo and about the gender stratification, the situation of women in South Africa at that time. So a couple of different things that I looked at was traditional Xhosa culture, which is the culture that I spent the most time with in the East London area. And then the apartheid era. And I know this seems more like a historical aspect, but I guess you can't talk about South Africa without talking about apartheid, because it had such an influential impact on the culture in that present time. And so I looked at both of those factors and how they affected women in South Africa. Okay, so let's look first. I'm going through this kind of fast, but I'd be happy to answer questions afterwards about any of my research. Traditional culture, and these are basically well-studied things that everyone that studies Xhosa culture will go back to these basic aspects of the culture. And the first is the marital practices. And Lobola, I'm sure many of you guys know what that is. It is a form of marital exchange. So. And it's quite controversial in South Africa. I've actually, just as I was preparing this, I pulled up a couple of articles, and people are really going back and forth on, does it objectify women or does it not? Is it a good thing or is it bad? And that's something that, Dave taught us well about cultural relativism, is to, when we look at cultures, that we have to look at it from different perspectives and, sort of shed our ethnocentrisms on what is right and what is wrong and what's valuable and what's not. But there is actually significant evidence that Lobola and that marital practice does have a significant impact on, or the influence of, the treatment of women in South African society. So basically, in that exchange, the family of the bride will give money, goods, or whatever to the bride's family will give, the male's family will give it to the bride's family, but you think, okay, well, it should go to the woman because, it's as a bridal gift, but it actually goes to her family. And so it does have implications on education, and there's been some studies that have tried to correlate between how that impacts education. And the idea is, I know Tiffany Ivins talked about a lot when she spoke about literacy, the idea of, watering someone else's garden, or, it's a return on investment that you won't gain. That investment of a woman's education will go to his family. And so there's a lot of controversy on whether that is a practice that influences, but I think in my experience, I did about 15 different interviews, long, intense interviews of women about why they didn't end up going to school. And this is a cross-section of women who are in adult literacy classes, which means they weren't able to receive formal education as they were growing up. And 15, I think it was 13 out of the 15 interviews that I had stated that the reason that they didn't receive a formal education because their parents didn't see it as important, or the mother did, but the father didn't. And so, Lobola may be a symbolic way of showing how education and how it impacts women in that way. Land ownership, I've talked about that, and roles and responsibilities in the home are very distinct in Xhosa culture. And the idea of machismo is mostly studied in the context of Latin American cultures, but is very evident in African cultures, and specifically Southern African cultures. And the idea basically is that machismo characteristics exaggerate traits of masculinity to compensate for inferiority. So pretty harsh definition, but just the idea that exaggerating your masculine traits and pinpointing female characteristics as weak or as inferior, and this is manifested in many different ways in South African culture, and specifically in Xhosa culture. And also rites of passage ceremony, another very controversial aspect of culture. But many studies that have been done that showed that male circumcision ceremonies is basically a rites of passage way in which how to teach men at a very young age how to be men, and what is formed in those thoughts and in that training in that specific area for that man at that time in his life is that, that you need to exhibit control over women and that your place in the home is to be the sole decision maker. And then often it's linked, and studies have linked circumcision with violence because it is somewhat of a violent act. And then also, if you do show fear when you are going through a circumcision ceremony, any sign of fear that you show, the group will take you out and beat you. Or if you're even observing the circumcision ceremony and you wince at someone that is going through the ceremony, that you will also be violently beaten or taken away. So the message to men at that very young age is that showing emotion, showing fear, will be treated with violence. So violence is a means of solving problems. And then in the other aspect of that is that fear is a feminine trait and shouldn't be exhibited in men. So these are cultural traits that I looked at. We had opportunities to interview people who were men who had gone out into the bush, as they call it, to their circumcision ceremony. And some other members in our group, we weren't allowed to because we were women, but some other men in the group were able to go and actually witness and came back. And they really did sort of enunciate the idea that it was a very specific way of training how to be men, and a lot of that was linked to violence and to viewing women as weak or inferior. Let me see. Oh, and actually one other experience I wanted to share, this idea of masculinity and how to be men and that sort of rites of passage. I had the opportunity to go out into a township with one of the other students who was doing some work with a nonprofit organization on rape and rape awareness. And so I was helping her run the workshop for this school of like 50 different students in the township, and it was like basically an assembly, and we didn't know really what we were doing, but we made some posters about how to educate people on rape, and we really wanted to get into discussions, and it was kind of too big of a group, but we wanted to get into discussion about the idea of that rape is wrong, that women have a right to say no. And it was so enlightening and disturbing at the same time, because the discussion ensued. We had this poster up that said a woman has a right to say no, and this, there's discussion, and these men, we could hear all these young boys were kind of muttering things and laughing, and we sort of pulled them aside, what's going on, what are you saying? And this older boy from the leader of the gang stands up and he said, I don't think this is true. I don't think women have a right to say no. He's like, if I paid, 3 rand to get on a taxi and I drove, 2 townships over to go see my girlfriend, she owes it to me. And it was such a disturbing thought. For one, maybe men in different cultures or societies think that, but that he felt safe enough to articulate it was was so disturbing, and to articulate it in front of a group. And as he said this, a bunch of boys, I can't say how many, started cheering and saying, yeah, and everyone was agreeing, and I see all these, look out into the sea of heads, and I see everyone shaking their head, yeah, that makes sense. And it's a disturbing insight into adolescent thinking, and I think it really is rooted in culture, because these are young boys who are very impressionable, and whether it's media or traditional culture or how they are raised, it's all rooted back to these traditions in Xhosa culture and what they were taught. And we'll talk more about some of violence against women in later issues, later in this presentation. But this is a picture that we showed in our literacy class, and Tiffany has used this. It's been used a lot in the literacy circles, and it's a very provocative picture. And take a second to look at it. And what do you see going on in this picture? You can shout it out. What do you see? Yeah, the woman working, the man relaxing. What else do you see?
It looks like a family.
Yeah, definitely. Looks like a family unit. Yep. Going home.
The females are carrying things, and the males are carrying things.
Quite different things, yes. Yeah, and so basically this picture is used to start a discussion on the role of women and the role of men in African culture or in their households. And we use this with a group of women that we're teaching literacy to. And it's very interesting because when I first looked at this picture, I thought, oh, it's a happy family, taking a little stroll. And then you look a little closer and you see, okay, there's a discrepancy in the workload distribution or the weight distribution. And I also talked to one of interviewed someone about this picture, an African male, and he said that he looked right at the man. He said, "Oh, he's doing the right thing. We learned that we learned in our circumcision ceremony that a man should never be seen without a hat and without a stick." And I said, "Well, what's the stick for?" And he said, "To keep your wife in line, to keep the women in line." So there's some deeply embedded, disturbing issues about how men are, taught about how to treat women. And the discussion that ensues from showing this to a group of women is very interesting. I didn't bring my notes, but I have some interview notes from them saying, and I can't read it verbatim, but the woman is saying, a woman's life is very hard. A woman has to carry everything, but this is the right way. And then other women in the group, perhaps even that were in our older literacy class that had more exposure to critical thinking and world ideas and things like that, would say, this is the way it is, but this is wrong. And so this is a springboard for social action, for analyzing your situation, the relevance of what they see in their day-to-day lives, and working through those problems. And I'll talk more about how we did that in the literacy program. This is just a picture of a boy, Abaqueta, who was going through the male circumcision ceremony. But one thing that I did want to briefly talk about for a second is just this idea of cultural relativism. So how I've talked about some pretty disturbing things in African culture and rooted in tradition. How do we reconcile those things? As sociologists, I remember taking a class saying that when you go in to do observations, you have that value-free mentality. You have no values. Go in there and just learn. And this is like the torturous question in the field. How do I reconcile this idea of I see things that are hurtful towards women, I see things that are hurtful towards society, but how do I reconcile them?
I think part of the thing is you have to be, because the thing is when you go into a new culture and you see things that are hurtful to another group, you see things that are hurtful from your perspective,
right,
and how you grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you have to be in the culture long enough to sort of understand the culture well enough that you can come to some kind of an area where you can judge what's going on from the context of that culture, not from the culture that you grew up in. Otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
you're just transferring value systems from one culture to another.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it's not very compatible until you understand that culture and the nuances of that culture, and then can sort of make judgments calls from what you understand the context of that culture to be. I don't know if that made any sense.
No, it does. I think, and that's a difficult thing to do. One of the examples I always use when talking about, cultural relativism and judging others, and also in some diversity training that I've done, is that I'm part Polynesian. I'm half Samoan, and I see a lot of my, Samoan family and friends who have a very different view of child abuse. Using the slipper to slap your kid around is not a painful, thing. But I look at it as a culture and I'd say, if that happened to me, I would be scarred for life. So there's definitely relativism in, what will impact your life and from your point of view. And it's hard to shed those ethnocentrism. We try so hard. I tried walking in and saying, okay, well, this is just culture. This is how it's happening. This is, what is status quo. But when do you trigger change? When do you want to facilitate change in a culture? When do you want to, tell a person that they need to fight against that that's not right? And I don't necessarily have any answers for you on that. I think it's very case-to-case basis, but it's one of those learnings that you learn when you go into the field that society and social problems are so much more complex than we can even imagine. Like I said, my mom says I was a born feminist. So going into a culture like this, I wanted to just put people on the chopping block and say, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And you have to take a step back and appreciate the parts of a culture. And sort of, you can facilitate discussions in a non-biased way in that people can decide for themselves if it's a situation that they want to change or they don't. And providing them with the right resources to make those educated decisions. And I think that's somewhat of an answer to the question, but it's also a very difficult one. The second factor that I looked at was apartheid and how it influenced South African culture, and specifically Black South African culture. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. So like I said, it's hard to talk about South Africa without talking about apartheid, and if you think about it, when I first went to South Africa, it was 1999, such an amazing time going on in South Africa. Apartheid was, still on the fringe of people's memory, not even on the fringe of people's memory. It was still so present in their minds, and there was so much hope going forward in the future. But at the same time, people were saying, it's been 4 or 5 years since, the apartheid regime has been gone. What is going on? So there was a lot of frustration, a lot of action, a lot of hope, all these, emotions in the national psyche going on that we got to be a part of. We actually were able to also be a part of the second ever democratic elections in South Africa, and be observers at the voting polls to make sure that people weren't cheating on their voting. I don't know what I would have done if someone was cheating, but just the opportunities we had to observe and explore and experience were just amazing. And I still feel like South Africa is such an amazing country right now and has so many wonderful things going on. A lot of times it's referred as the microcosm of the world. So you name a social problem and South Africa has it. You name a progressive development program and South Africa is working on it. With all the different cultures and the historical context that you live in, it's just a wonderful place to study. So I won't go in too much on, what apartheid is and what it did, but just to let you know that it was an important aspect of my research. All of these legislations that are listed here basically separated the people of South Africa. So the blacks were separated into their different townships. Thank you. And whites were separated into their, suburban areas, and even in some cases in the Western Cape, they were divided between Indians and Asians and so forth. So the master plan of apartheid was, to keep people separate. What's wrong with being separate? And we're all different, so we should all have separate things. But as we know, in practice, this doesn't happen, and great injustices occurred and inequalities occurred. The other part of apartheid that was very influential on the status of women is Bantu education system, and this has been termed the education for serfdom. And he was quoted by saying the maker or the policymaker of Bantu education once said, it's an education system to teach whites, coloreds, and blacks at a very early age their specific purpose to play in society. So, reading between the lines, you realize that they're saying, okay, blacks will be educated to be the unskilled labor, and will be educated to be leaders of the country. And the education curriculum was exactly that, or if it non-existent in the black communities. So the impact that this had on the black family. So I'll ask this question to you. So apartheid is basically separating groups of people so they can't interact with each other. And a lot of times whites had absolutely no exposure to the townships. In fact, when I was there in South Africa, it's a common thing that whites do not go in the townships, and they don't know what goes on there. They don't know the living conditions. They think we're crazy to be going in there, and we probably are partly crazy for going in there. But they had no exposure to the social problems and the conditions that blacks were living in at that time. And then at the same time, you have this educational system that is teaching people for their rightful roles in society, as subservient and as a leader. And as one of the labor laws legislation, what it did also was that you have all these blacks in rural areas or in informal settlements outside the cities. And what it did is it created a huge out-migration of the male from the family. And 42% in 1994 was recorded that single female-headed households, 42% single female-headed households in South Africa at that time. And largely because of this legislation that drove men to leave the rural areas to find work, their wives and their families weren't allowed to follow them to the city, which left a disproportionate number of women caring for families on their own. And in addition to this oppression of apartheid, men were as they are working in these in the cities, they built these huge hostels, just male hostels that only men could live in. And, as you can imagine, impoverished men who were working long hours in dangerous working conditions, and their wives and their families are far away, a lot of times would start extramarital affairs. They would start whole new families, so they'd have a whole family and kids and everything in the urban areas, and then also one in the rural areas. So really, I think we talk a lot about in our religion or on this campus about the importance of family. And I think all of us understand the important part that the family plays in society. And for apartheid to take that away and to destroy the family unit had devastating effects on the South African society, and specifically on women. Let me see here. Oh, and out-migration was said to be 33% in the Eastern Cape, when the Eastern Cape, for some reason, tends to have the worst statistics in terms of poverty. So this is a quote from South Africa's Lawyers for Human Rights, and it says, "Both sexes are trapped in rigidly defined gender roles and exploited practices. However, the consequence of disempowerment is more painfully experienced by women who suffer further physical and psychological abuse at the hands of men stripped of dignity and able to control their lives." So think for a second, all of the aspects of traditional culture that we talked about, and how the male is the head of the household, he's the breadwinner, he makes the decisions, and he needs to have control over his family in order to feel like a man. And then take apartheid, who basically disempowered men to perform their roles and responsibilities in the family, and the impact that has on women. And I think one of the ways that that has been manifested itself is in the tremendous violent crime rates against women in South Africa. Let me see. A couple more stats. South Africa has the highest rape statistics of all countries not at war, and this was in 1999. A woman is raped every 26 seconds, and 1 in 3 women in South Africa will be raped in their lifetime. So this is 1999 statistics. I don't know exactly what they are today, but I have a good idea that they haven't decreased much, and there's also new factors involved that make it even more dangerous to women. But South African women really did feel the brunt of everything. If you look at society's place, everyone in hierarchies, and women and children are always at the bottom of that. So when people are disempowered and frustrated and not able to perform their roles of what makes them worth and of value, women are the ones that receive the burden of that, whether it be lack of education, of opportunities, employment, and violence. All those are ways that that oppression against a society is manifested on women, and women really do are exposed and most vulnerable to the worst of those causes. I don't have time to go into exactly, but unemployment rate at the time when I was there was 44% for black women and 33% for black men. And education was in quite ruins. And this is, after apartheid, the government's just trying to get back on their feet and figure out their system. But in the rural areas, 1/3 of black women had absolutely no education at all, and only 15% of those women had any primary education. So, if you look at the gender stratification, those indices that I described before, and the impact that they had on women, whether it be traditional culture and or apartheid, it had multiplying effects on women, and they really did hold the largest burden in that society. So these are kind of some old statistics of, I was there at a very crucial time. So there's been some new victories, and I was excited when I was trying to update my statistics to find these. And South Africa has been great in their budgeting and their policy development on being gender sensitive and realizing that women did need to be a focus of development efforts in South Africa. This is a gender parity index, which basically tries to measure the parity between sexes. So if it's over 1, then it will be in favor of women, and if it's under 1, it'll be in favor of men. So you can see that net intake is the enrollment rates of women or females in primary and secondary schools. So quite an improvement from the statistics that what I was experiencing when I was there in 1999, 0.94, which is very close to parity. And then survival of primary school and a transfer to secondary school, which is a great measurement, because I think, okay, so they're in school and they're enrolled, but do they stay in school and do they make that transfer to a higher level of education? And that's actually in favor of women, which is really interesting. And South Africa has been one of the only countries in South Africa, or in the southern South African hemisphere, that has made provisions for for girls who have been pregnant to come back to school. And I think that has made a big impact on women staying in school and being able to be educated. There's also quite a bit of, these are victorious stats, I think, looking at what they were before, and especially during apartheid and post-apartheid. These are, tremendous feats. But there's also quite controversial, because it doesn't really measure the quality of the education and the experience of education that women go through, but it's still a step in the right direction. But there are some growing challenges. This is a disturbing photograph. Can you guys see that very well? Let me see this. I have a pointer. Wow, okay. So this is a male student, and this is a girl student, and this is part of what is called a photo voice project. And these photographers were going into schools trying to give girls specifically a voice on what is going on in their lives. And so they asked them the question, where are the safe and unsafe places in your school? And this is the photograph that a group of 7th grade girls wanted to portray, about what they were experiencing in their girlhood, and specifically in school. And this is the picture that they came up with. It's an enactment of a rape. And this other picture here on the side is also part of that same photo voice project. And it's a girl, basically portraying to us that she feels unsafe going to the bathroom in her own school because of the likelihood of rape. The Mail and Guardian, which is a very respected newspaper in South Africa, reported that that 30% of women who are raped at school, which is very disturbing, because if you imagine our school experience, it's a place where you feel safe, or where you should feel safe. I mean, okay, you have the occasional teasing, but are you fearful of being raped? Are you in fear of your life at your own school? So these are some disturbing statistics coming out of what is going on today in the growing challenges. There's also quite a bit of literature on the girlhood studies, on girlhood study and the gendering of AIDS, which is a very interesting take on studying AIDS in South Africa. There's been a lot of research on AIDS, but how does it affect specifically women and girls? So 23% of South African youth are infected with AIDS. That is a staggering statistic. Girls' infection rate is reported to be 3 to 4 times higher than boys. There also came out a new study by the Human Rights Watch, and this is by a group of nonprofit organizations, and it's called the Dossier of Shame Report. And if any of you guys want to look it up, I have references. And it highlights the rape of children by teachers, as well as sexual abuse of female learners, some as young as 6 by gangs of boys, some between the ages of 8 and 12 years old. Indeed, the report indicates that almost 24% of the offenders that one clinic deals with are between the age of 7 and 14 years old. So the perpetrators and the victims are all under the age of 14, and then adding to that the disturbing fact that girls are being raped by teachers and administrators. So from what we take away from this is there's a lot of progress going on in South Africa, but there's so many deeply embedded problems that have been influenced by apartheid and also by traditional culture that are here to stay and that need to be dealt with and need specific attention to. So sorry on that disturbing note. I want to talk a little bit about my internship at the Literacy Center. And it was called the Salem Baby Center, and it was sponsored by the Community of Child Development Center, CCDC. And this is a picture. Those of you guys who remember Tiffany, she's famous, and then also my other friend Kristen. There's 4 interns of us, and we took on to teach 3 literacy courses at 3 different levels to a group of. Each class had about 20 different learners, and what an amazing experience. And this is why I want to end on more of a happy note. And sorry about the sign, but I just thought it was so funny. It brings back so many memories. But this is spoken on a lesson about how breastfeeding can help women and children, and educating them on how using your breast milk is better than using formula. And we actually integrated an arithmetic study on this where we got out money and we're teaching them how to count and budget for their household, and we did a budget line on what it costs for formula and bottles and all that stuff, and then what it costs to breastfeed. So this is a way that we integrated life skills relevant to what is going on in their daily lives to enact social change, and at the same time teaching them to be literate. And this is what is called the Literacy for Social Change model that I was introduced to here at the Kennedy Center, and that I think is a wonderful model for social change and also for education for adult learners. But basically, it takes these 3 aspects of cultural celebration, self-sufficiency, and social action, and integrating those all into lessons of literacy. So why learn about Jack and Jill ran up the hill, or Bill and Ted did this or whatever, but that they're actually learning in the context of their own lives. What are things that they are experiencing that are relevant to their daily lives, talking about household budgets, about being a mother, about breastfeeding, about all those issues that are going on, how to say no, rape awareness, violence in the home, all those issues that we were learning about at the same time we were learning about literacy, teaching them about literacy. So the group of mothers that I worked with all came from Duncan Village, which is a squatter camp. This is actually a picture of Umdansani, but it looks very similar. They're all single mothers, and they were all various degrees illiterate. So a perfect population or a research sample for me as I was studying gender stratification, to constantly be interacting with these women who I was interested in studying at the same time. Just briefly to go through, we did some assessments of where they were in learning. We developed the curriculum. We actually used a Literacy for Social Change module, but we took each of the lessons and made them our own for our specific learners, and we created activities and homework assignments and all that curriculum that goes into developing learning modules. And then we also developed a manual to be used for future classes. So these are some pictures that also bring back wonderful memories of the class. Bottles on the table along with pencils and paper. And this is one of my favorite pictures of, a mother working with a baby on her back. And this was the working environment that I was exposed to. And just the energy in that room was just beautiful. And I can't even articulate what it was like. But just to have all these women who are mothers and so eager to learn, who had come from such difficult circumstances, was such a humbling experience to be around. And I felt so privileged to be able to be teaching them. But as I learned quickly that you learn more than you can teach in these type of situations. And this is actually a picture that we used to do some level assessments on literacy skills and to start a critical discussion on this picture. And it was interesting because we showed this picture, and I have some of their worksheets here and how they filled it out, and it was so fun to go back and look at them. But the typical response was, that mother is suffering. She has no husband, and she loves her children, and that baby in her stomach will not be fed. So interesting insight into, a picture that I would say, it looks like a family portrait that we would hang on a wall or something, but it is a springboard for a discussion about what is going on in their lives. And the discussions that we had as groups of women and as teachers and as learners was so insightful into their situation and the gender stratification going on at that time. I don't have time, but one of the lessons that I wanted to talk about was that we talked about, it was one of the final lessons was on hopes and dreams. And so we asked them as a warm-up activity, what do you hope for your children? What are your hopes and dreams for your children? Because they're all mothers. And every single learner said in their own way or another said that they want their kids to go to school. They want them to be able to read and write, and they want them to have an education. And because that was one of the things that I really struggled with as I was teaching. I thought, okay, these are adult women who, already have 3 or 4 children. They're caring for their children's children. They have all these variables that are going to keep them from really, making it in mainstream society as what we call successful and what we call happy. But it was this lesson that sort of opened my eyes to the idea that, happiness can be found in all different types of situations and all circumstances. And the fact that in some way or another we perhaps instilled a little bit of hope or in them about the future and the power of knowledge and the power of education makes you realize how development can't just work in the immediate, but it needs to work in through generations. So these women, they may not go out and go to college and get a job and be really work in the formal economy, but their children have a hope of that because these mothers know the value of education and want to have that for their children. And being a mother myself recently, you can't keep women, especially mothers, from what they want in life. And so if we can instill that there's importance in learning, I think these women will find a way. And that's my hope, at least. So I'd like to close on just 4 points that I have that where learning has transcended in my life. And the first is that the duality of culture as resilient and dynamic. So I've talked a lot about how traditional culture and apartheid have impacted, in a lot of times negatively, the culture of today's South Africa and what's going on today. But at the same time, the hope in that duality of the definition of culture is that it's dynamic. That just as apartheid can impact South Africa for the negative, development work and volunteers and everything, all the action that's going on in South Africa can change that culture to the better. Take out the good, take the good and take out the bad. So that idea is very powerful. The second is that awareness of the systemic nature of societal problems. I mean, I was tortured in South Africa. You should read my journals. In fact, I think Lynn England, one of my professors over there, after he read it, he said, wow, I couldn't put it down. I thought, oh, that's embarrassing when he was reading that. But it was just this saga of my learning experience and my growth. But South Africa is so complex, and I think our tendency is to... am I on there? Oh, sorry. Our tendency is to simplify problems and to treat symptoms, and that there's also an intense need for concerted efforts and looking at the holistic approaches. One quick example of how that is true, that we tend to simplify problems, is the work that I did the second time I went with street children. This is a picture of children in a street shelter that I worked at, and it's just a day center, okay? So you can see smiling faces, we're goofing around, we teach, a little bit of math, we have activities, it's a really fun atmosphere. And then we started to realize, okay, well, they're only there during the day, but these children are going out on the weekends and at night and having no food. So we thought, okay, well, we'll make them some breakfast on Saturdays. As students, we would do that almost every Saturday that we were there. And then the reality sits in. It's like this intuitively, but you have to see it for yourself to believe it. And this is a picture of some situations of where the street children were going at night. And this is the shacks that they were living in and the conditions that they were living in. And this is a sad story, but that boy in the right-hand corner, Sibusiso, we were like, one of the students took a picture of him and, oh, is he sleeping? What's wrong with him? Or is he okay? He's not waking up. And one of the kids goes over and kicks him, and he said, oh, I forgot last night he got hit over the head by a man with a stick, and he was convulsing. And I thought, if that were to happen anywhere where I was present, we'd be rushing to the emergency room and doing all these things. But this kid was, sitting there with probably the biggest headache of his life, and who knows what type of damage he had. Over here in the left-hand corner, you can see there's a water well that the children are washing themselves from. Right next to that water well is the other side of it. There's pigs and garbage and all this that, surrounding their circumstances. So it just sort of, for me, revealed the complexities of the situations that, we have this day shelter, we're doing these great things, we're having fun activities, but how can we look at this holistically to change their circumstances? And is the day shelter maybe even a reason why they're staying on the streets, because they know that we can go and have fun and we'll feed them and they don't have to answer to parents? So the problems are just so complex. This is another example. This is a anti-drug rally that we were at, and this is a huge, the whole community's coming out and they're talking about drug awareness and how it's bad and all the consequences of it. And this is kind of symbolic, but at the end, the drug rally ends up this big speaker symposium and a talent show kind of thing, enthusiastic thing. And the only place that they could find to have it at was in front of the liquor store in the township. So it just reveals the irony, the complexity of situations and solving problems, not only in South Africa, but in anywhere you try to do development work. The third one is empowerment of individuals is critical in facilitating change. And I've learned this a lot, even in my consulting work in businesses, that people want to be heard and they want to have a voice. I've done some work in petroleum plants, and one of the first things, they had a bunch of production problems, and the first things that I said is, well, let's talk to the frontline workers. And that's something I learned from, being in South Africa. It's, let's get at the grassroots level. What's here, what needs to be done, what's going on. They have the answers. And empowering people at an individual level is the first catalyst for change. And the last learning that transcends in my life is learning about culture and seeking to appreciate other cultures can break down boundaries that keep us from solving problems, building relationships, and cooperating with others. And this is a slide from a workshop that I did in a software company. And for me, this is revolutionary, because the idea that businesses, commonly known as exploiting people at all levels, is talking about culture, is talking about the importance of knowing and understanding people and building bridges and building relationships. And, this is, Hofstede is the talk of the talk in management circles right now. And, development and sociologists and social science workers are saying, oh yeah, we've been saying this for a long time, but it's transcending. Businesses are getting it. Businesses are seeing the importance of talking and understanding about culture. Lastly, I just wanted to end with one of my favorite quotes from a reading that Dave gave me. And it's called, "It is through the mirror of others that we learn to know ourselves. It is through facing our own discomfort and anxiety that we learn to stretch and grow." And truly, this is the value of field studies experiences. There's no way I could have grown in the way that I could have if I didn't put myself out there in vulnerable situations and, put myself outside myself. And that's when you learn more about yourself. And it's so important, I think, for us to have those type of experiences, to take them with us through other parts of our lives. Sorry, I actually have one more. So one more quote. Human beings are such an incredibly rich and talented species with potentials beyond anything it is possible to contemplate. It must appear our greatest task, our most important task, and our most strategic task is to learn as much as possible about ourselves and others. My point is that humans learn more about the incredible sensitivity, their boundless talents, and manifold diversity when they begin to appreciate not only themselves but also others. And that is the task that I took on going to South Africa, is learning about myself and learning more about others. And if everyone had that on their life's agenda of what to do, I think we could break down boundaries. We can understand the boundlessness of human nature and of our human capabilities. And I guess that's all I have to say. I think I have 30 seconds for Q&A. Thank you. Okay, 2 questions. Anyone?
At what age does the male circumcision ceremony normally take place? And also, is there any religious implication in it, or is it just purely cultural?
Well, it's interesting. It's normally around the age of 18. You can read a great account of it in Mandela's book, Long Walk to Freedom. But I just read a report before I came, is that the folklore, the roots of the circumcision ceremony actually started from when the Xhosa tribe was going to war with the Zulu tribe. One of the men stayed behind. He was the only man left in the village, and he actually had sexual relations with every woman in the village. And when he came back in order to punish himself, he went into the bush and circumcised himself. And so the paper that was, reporting this showed how male circumcision basically is giving this folklore, this man who had done this, a hero-like status, so that we all want to be like him, so we'll all go into the bush and be circumcised. So I don't know that this is written in an academic paper. I can give you the references on it, but it really does show the roots were quite negative of why we actually go into the bush and become circumcised. So I don't know of any religious reasoning. Any other questions?
Yeah, this isn't formulated very well, but I was just thinking about these different cultural activities or items that we talk about, this cultural relativity thing. They have multiple functions, and it seems like by any standards or from any perspective, you do come to a decision that perhaps something negative is happening here, and this particular aspect of the culture is negative or harmful or hurtful. But then there are the benefits of it, even like circumcision ceremony. I mean, it's a powerful tool for unifying and connecting, relatives. Often kinship is involved, and there will be some other, I'm sure, latent functions that are positive. Is there a way? I mean, you deal with cultural you're consulting and different things you've dealt with and will be dealing with in your future. You'll be dealing with some of these issues and complexities of culture. Can you think of ways, or even in the South African context, in which you can eliminate the negative or the bad, but preserve somehow some of the good? In other words, instead of doing away with culture or doing away with an aspect. And are there NGOs that are attempting that? Yeah. I don't think I heard of any.
Well, I know in the case of male circumcision, it's also been linked to the spread of AIDS because of the health practices of the actual circumcision. But I do know of a nonprofit organization that was working with, this is some aspect, not solving the social problem directly or completely, but they were having, Western doctors working with traditional doctors in educating the actual circumciser about how to do it with more health conscious behavior. So that's in a small way. There's ways I think that you can say, okay, circumcision doesn't necessarily have to be done with, but how do we go in and look at the positive of kinship and group unity and all those things and make it a positive form. Even with Lobola, a lot of women see it as, this is a way that a man is showing value. I feel valued and important when there is an exchange on my behalf, even if it doesn't go to me directly. And so I think, reconciling that is like a universal question that we'll always ask, and you have to take it case by case. But I think even in my own culture, I look at, we look at ourselves and say, yeah, there's great things that we can appreciate, and there's things that we don't like about our culture. And as individuals, we make those decisions about moving forward and what we take with us and what we don't. And it's a hard thing to deal with, definitely.
You could even think of AIDS awareness being taught in a camp if the elders were, thoughtful or wished to do it or participate in it, or the non-objectification of women being taught to the young men in the camp, because that liminal stage is a powerful stage for instructing young men. You hate to not capitalize on it or to lose the opportunity.
Yeah, and use those same traditional avenues of culture to, remedy some of the things that are destructive. And then you kind of have to evaluate on a scale of human rights, Is this a violation of human rights? And, how can we, still celebrate our culture, but at the same time move forward with a progressive view?